Get him out before he embarrasses this company. The words landed with the cold certainty of a judge's final ruling. For a moment, the entire boardroom went silent. Then a few uneasy chuckles rippled around the polished walnut table. At the center of it all stood Marcus Reed, his expression calm, his hands resting loosely at his sides. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched behind him, revealing the glittering Manhattan skyline under a pale autumn afternoon. The city looked endless from the 42nd floor, a kingdom of steel and glass built by people who believed power could be measured in square footage and stock prices. Victoria Sterling certainly believed that. Seated at the head of the table in a tailored navy suit, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics fixed Marcus with a look that mixed annoyance and disbelief. She had spent the last hour presenting her company's expansion strategy to investors, executives, and advisors. Every seat in the room carried influence. Every voice carried weight. At least, that was what Victoria thought. Marcus had been sitting quietly near the end of the table, listening. His charcoal blazer was simple. His watch looked ordinary. His leather portfolio showed signs of wear. Nothing about him matched the image most people expected when they imagined wealth. And that was exactly why nobody had paid attention to him. Until he spoke. What happens to your frontline employees if the market shifts 6 months after launch? Marcus had asked. The question itself wasn't complicated. In fact, it was surprisingly simple. Yet something about it seemed to irritate Victoria immediately. She leaned back in her chair and folded her arms. We're discussing growth strategy, she replied. Not hypothetical problems. Marcus nodded politely. Sometimes the way a company treats people during difficult times tells you more than any financial projection. A few executives exchanged glances. One cleared his throat. Another stared down at his tablet. The room suddenly felt smaller. Victoria's jaw tightened. She had built Sterling Dynamics into one of the fastest-growing technology firms in America. Business magazines praised her leadership. Investors admired her confidence. Employees respected her results. But there was one thing Victoria could never tolerate: being questioned in her own boardroom. And exactly who are you? She asked. Marcus remained calm. Someone interested in understanding the company. Then understand this, Victoria said sharply. We didn't invite you here to lecture us. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to touch. Outside the glass walls, sunlight reflected off neighboring skyscrapers like flashes of silver fire. Inside, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Marcus simply looked at her. Not angry. Not embarrassed. Just thoughtful. The kind of look that made people uncomfortable because it revealed nothing. Victoria turned toward security standing near the entrance. Please escort him out. The words echoed through the room. A few people shifted awkwardly in their seats. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Marcus slowly picked up his portfolio. Of course, he said. No argument. No protest. No attempt to defend himself. That almost made the situation stranger. As he walked toward the door, the room seemed determined to forget him already. Presentations resumed. Laptops opened. Charts reappeared on giant screens. Yet just before stepping into the hallway, Marcus paused for half a second and glanced back across the boardroom. His eyes settled briefly on Victoria Sterling. Then he smiled. Not a bitter smile. Not a defeated smile. Just a quiet one. The kind of smile that suggested he understood something nobody else in the room did. And by this time tomorrow, everyone at Sterling Dynamics would wish they had listened. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, shutting out the boardroom and the people who had dismissed him so easily. Marcus Reed stood alone as the car descended through 42 floors of polished steel and mirrored walls. His reflection stared back at him, calm and unreadable. Most people would have been angry. Some would have argued. Others might have spent the ride replaying every insult in their minds. Marcus did none of those things. He simply adjusted the strap of his leather portfolio and watched the floor numbers count down. Years ago, he had learned that people often revealed their true character when they believed someone had nothing to offer them. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, his decision had already been made. Outside, the late afternoon air carried the sharp scent of approaching rain. Yellow taxis rolled past the glass entrance while employees hurried down crowded sidewalks, clutching coffee cups and smartphones. Marcus stepped into the flow of Manhattan without attracting a second glance. He preferred it that way. Few people recognized his face, and that was intentional. Horizon Growth Fund rarely placed its founder in front of cameras. Reporters knew the company. Financial networks discussed its investments. Business schools studied its success. But Marcus remained largely invisible. That invisibility had become one of his greatest advantages. A black SUV waited at the curb. The driver opened the rear door as Marcus approached. "How did it go?" the driver asked. Marcus settled into the seat and looked through the tinted window at the towering Sterling Dynamics headquarters. "Better than expected," he replied quietly. The driver frowned, confused, but asked no further questions. 20 minutes later, the vehicle pulled into a private underground garage beneath a modern office tower overlooking the Hudson River. The building carried no flashy signs and no giant corporate logos. From the outside, it appeared almost ordinary. Inside, however, billions of dollars in investment decisions were made every year. Marcus crossed the lobby, greeting receptionists and analysts by name. Smiles appeared instantly. People stood straighter when they saw him, not because they feared him, but because they respected him. On the 34th floor, a conference room was already waiting. Several senior partners sat around the table reviewing reports. A large screen displayed the final evaluation scores for multiple companies competing for funding. Sterling Dynamics occupied the top line. Strong revenue growth, expanding market share, impressive projections. Yet another category sat near the bottom of the screen. Leadership culture assessment. Marcus took his seat. "How was the site visit?" one partner asked. Marcus opened his portfolio and removed a thin notebook. "Informative," he said. Another executive leaned forward. "Do you believe they are ready for a $500 million partnership?" For a moment, Marcus did not answer. The room grew quiet. Outside the windows, gray clouds rolled across the river, turning the water dark and reflective. Finally, he opened the notebook and looked down at a single sentence he had written after leaving Sterling Dynamics. It was not about profits. It was not about technology. It was not about growth. The sentence read, "How do they treat people who appear powerless?" Marcus closed the notebook. Around the table, everyone waited. Every recommendation he made carried enormous weight. Every decision could shape the future of a company. He looked at the faces surrounding him and spoke calmly. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "we will discuss Sterling Dynamics." Then he stood and walked toward the window, watching the first drops of rain strike the glass as darkness slowly settled over Manhattan. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with low clouds hanging over Manhattan like a heavy curtain. By 7:30, the executive floor at Sterling Dynamics was already alive with movement. Assistants hurried between offices carrying reports. Analysts reviewed market updates glowing across multiple monitors. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the hallways as employees prepared for what Victoria Sterling expected to be one of the most important days in the company's history. She stood in her corner office overlooking the city, confident that the final investment announcement would validate years of relentless work. A framed magazine cover rested on a shelf behind her desk. Her face stared back beneath a headline celebrating visionary leadership. Victoria had spent years building that reputation, and she intended to protect it. At 8:15, her chief financial officer entered carrying a tablet. Something in his expression immediately felt wrong. "The Horizon decision is scheduled for 9 o'clock, he said. Victoria nodded without looking up from a spreadsheet. "Good. Once the partnership is announced, move forward with the expansion timeline." The man hesitated. "There is one concern." Victoria finally raised her eyes. "What concern?" "Their evaluation team requested additional internal reports last night." Victoria frowned. "That is normal due diligence. Not this late in the process." A silence settled between them. Outside the glass walls, rain streaked slowly down the windows. The chief financial officer shifted uneasily. "Do you think something changed?" Victoria asked. "I do not know." She leaned back in her chair. For the first time that morning, a faint feeling of uncertainty slipped into the room. Meanwhile, 30 blocks away, the leadership team at Horizon Growth Fund gathered around a long conference table overlooking the Hudson River. The atmosphere was calm, focused, and surprisingly quiet. Marcus Reed sat near the center of the table reviewing the final assessment report. Every page had been checked twice. Every score had been debated. Every recommendation had been documented. One partner adjusted his glasses and looked toward Marcus. Financially, they remain one of the strongest candidates. Another executive nodded. "Their technology platform is exceptional." Marcus listened without interruption. Then he turned a single page. At the bottom appeared the category that had generated the longest discussion: Leadership Culture Assessment. The score was dramatically lower than every other section. Numbers tell us what a company earns, Marcus said quietly. Culture tells us what a company becomes. Several heads nodded around the room. No one disagreed. Back at Sterling Dynamics, the clock reached 8:58. Victoria entered the boardroom surrounded by senior executives. The large presentation screen displayed a countdown to the investment announcement. Anticipation filled the room. Conversations grew quieter. Chairs stopped moving. Phones were placed face down on the table. At exactly 9 o'clock, the screen refreshed. A new document appeared. Victoria smiled at first. Then the smile disappeared. Her eyes moved across the page once. Then again. The room became completely silent. The recommendation from Horizon Growth Fund was clear. Sterling Dynamics had been removed from consideration. The reason appeared beneath the decision in simple black letters. Leadership culture presents unacceptable long-term risk. No one spoke. No one even seemed to breathe. Victoria stared at the screen as a strange memory surfaced in her mind. A calm voice asking a simple question. A man carrying a worn leather portfolio. A quiet smile before leaving the room. Suddenly, the rejection itself no longer felt like the real shock. The real shock was the growing realization that the stranger she had dismissed yesterday had never been a stranger at all. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The boardroom at Sterling Dynamics felt colder than before, as if the rejection displayed on the giant screen had drained all the warmth from the room. Victoria Sterling remained standing at the head of the table, her eyes fixed on the words that refused to change no matter how many times she read them. Around her, senior executives exchanged nervous glances. A few quietly checked their phones. Others stared down at their notes, avoiding eye contact. The company had built its entire expansion strategy around the expectation of Horizon Growth Fund's partnership. Without that capital, several major projects would be delayed. Some might disappear entirely. Victoria finally broke the silence. I want every detail on this decision. Her voice remained controlled, but everyone could hear the tension underneath. Within minutes, legal teams, analysts, and investor relations specialists were gathering information. Reports arrived. Emails were reviewed. Background files were opened. Then, shortly before noon, a young analyst entered carrying a tablet. His face looked pale. You need to see this. Victoria took the device and frowned. On the screen appeared a photograph from Horizon Growth Fund's leadership page. The image showed a conference room overlooking the Hudson River. Seated near the center of the table was a familiar face. The same calm expression. The same measured eyes. The same man who had quietly walked out of her boardroom less than 24 hours earlier. Marcus Reed, founder and managing partner. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. The room suddenly seemed smaller. That is impossible, one executive whispered. Another leaned closer to the screen. That was him. The analyst nodded. He founded Horizon 12 years ago. Current assets under management exceed $8 billion. Silence returned. Only this time it carried something heavier than surprise. Regret. Victoria lowered herself into a chair. Her memory replayed every moment from the previous afternoon. The simple question Marcus had asked. The patience in his voice. The lack of arrogance. The absence of any attempt to impress anyone. Then she remembered the way she had responded. The realization settled slowly, like a stone sinking beneath dark water. She had not rejected a visitor. She had rejected the very person evaluating whether her company deserved $500 million in funding. Across the city, Marcus sat in his office reviewing quarterly reports. Rain tapped softly against the windows. A cup of black coffee rested beside an open notebook. His assistant entered carrying a folder. Sterling Dynamics has called 6 times this morning. Marcus glanced up. Only 6. The assistant smiled slightly. There will probably be more. Marcus returned his attention to the report. Did they leave a message? The CEO would like to schedule an urgent meeting. He considered the request for a moment. Outside, ferries moved slowly across the gray Hudson River. The city seemed quieter beneath the rain. Tell them I am unavailable today. The assistant nodded. And tomorrow? Marcus closed the report. Tomorrow depends on whether they want an investment or whether they want to understand why they lost one. As the assistant left, Marcus looked back toward the window. Far beyond the rain and skyscrapers stood the city where his mother had once worked 2 jobs to support their family. a city where many people had underestimated her because of her appearance before discovering her strength. He thought about Victoria Sterling and the choices people make when they believe status determines value. Then he quietly opened his notebook and wrote a single line beneath yesterday's entry. Character always reveals itself before opportunity does. The following morning, the rain had stopped, but the tension inside Sterling Dynamics felt heavier than ever. News of the rejected investment had spread throughout the company. Conversations that normally focused on product launches and quarterly forecasts now revolved around a single question. How had they lost Horizon Growth Fund? Victoria Sterling stood alone in her office long before sunrise, staring at the city below. The lights of Manhattan reflected against the glass, turning the window into a mirror. For the first time in years, she was not thinking about competitors, revenue, or market share. She was thinking about a man she had judged within seconds. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her chief financial officer entered carrying a stack of reports. "The board wants answers," he said quietly. Victoria nodded. "They deserve them." He hesitated before speaking again. "Several directors believe we should request a formal review of Horizon's decision." Victoria looked up. And what exactly would that accomplish? The question hung in the air. Neither of them had an answer. Deep down, they both understood the truth. The rejection was not caused by numbers. It was caused by something much harder to measure. Across town, Horizon Growth Fund was beginning its day. Analysts reviewed proposals. Executives prepared for meetings. The atmosphere remained calm and focused. Marcus Reed walked through the office greeting employees by name. A young receptionist smiled as he passed. An intern nervously introduced himself near the elevator. Marcus stopped and shook the young man's hand. "Welcome to the team," he said. The intern's face brightened instantly. Small moments like that often went unnoticed, but Marcus believed leadership was revealed in ordinary interactions. By mid-morning, another request from Sterling Dynamics arrived. Then another. Then a fourth. His assistant placed the messages on his desk. They seemed determined. Marcus glanced at the growing stack. Determination is useful. Reflection is more useful. His assistant smiled. "Do you want me to continue declining?" Marcus looked toward the window overlooking the Hudson River. Sunlight had finally broken through the clouds, turning the water silver. "No," he said after a moment. "Schedule 30 minutes tomorrow afternoon." The assistant raised an eyebrow. "You are willing to meet?" Everyone deserves the opportunity to learn. Meanwhile, Victoria received the call she had been hoping for. The moment she heard that Marcus had agreed to a meeting, relief washed across the room. Yet it lasted only a few seconds. Because now came the harder part. Facing him. That evening, long after most employees had gone home, Victoria remained at her desk reviewing Horizon's evaluation report. She expected criticism of strategy. She expected concerns about execution. Instead, one sentence continued drawing her attention. "Leadership culture presents unacceptable long-term risk." She read it again and again. The words felt less like an accusation and more like a mirror. Her eyes drifted toward the dark window. For years, she had measured success through growth charts and financial statements. But she suddenly wondered how many talented people she had overlooked because they did not fit her expectations. How many voices had gone unheard because they came from the wrong seat at the table. The city outside remained bright and restless, but Victoria barely noticed. Tomorrow was no longer about securing funding. Tomorrow was about confronting a truth she could no longer ignore. The following afternoon arrived with clear skies and cool autumn sunlight stretching across the Hudson River. Inside Horizon Growth Fund's headquarters, everything felt calm. The lobby remained quiet. The reception desk gleamed beneath soft lighting. Employees moved with steady confidence through the building. Nothing suggested that one of the most important meetings of the year was about to take place. Victoria Sterling stepped out of the elevator and paused for a moment. The atmosphere felt different from the corporate environments she was accustomed to. There were no oversized displays celebrating success. No walls covered with awards. No signs of status competing for attention. Instead, the space felt purposeful, grounded, almost peaceful. A receptionist greeted her warmly and offered coffee. Victoria thanked her and took a seat near the window overlooking the river. As she waited, she noticed something unusual. Several employees stopped to thank one another. A senior executive held a door open for an intern. A manager carried his own stack of files instead of handing them to an assistant. Small moments, ordinary moments, yet they revealed something she had overlooked for years. Culture was not created during speeches. It was created through daily behavior. Upstairs, Marcus Reed stood alone in his office. Sunlight reflected across framed photographs resting on a bookshelf behind his desk. One picture showed a younger Marcus standing beside his mother outside a small apartment building in Atlanta. Another showed the first 5 employees of Horizon gathered around a folding table many years earlier. The furniture had been inexpensive. The office had been tiny. But everyone in the picture was smiling. Marcus picked up the photograph for a moment. He remembered those early days clearly. Investors who ignored him. Meetings where people assumed he was support staff instead of the founder. Opportunities that disappeared the moment certain assumptions were made about who he was. Yet he also remembered something else. The people who believed in him before success arrived. The mentors who opened doors. The teachers who encouraged him. The kindness that changed the direction of his life. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant stepped inside. "She is here." Marcus nodded. "Thank you." After the door closed, he remained still for several seconds. Outside the window, sunlight shimmered across the water like scattered silver. The city looked beautiful from this height. Quiet. Distant. He thought about yesterday's rejection and the attention it had generated. He thought about the questions everyone expected him to ask. He thought about the power he now held in this situation. Then he slowly returned the photograph to the shelf. Because despite everything that had happened, this meeting was never really about revenge. It was about truth. Downstairs, Victoria sat with her hands folded together. For the first time in many years, she felt genuinely nervous. Not because of money. Not because of investors. Because she knew she was about to face someone who had seen her at her worst. A few moments later, an assistant approached. "Mr. Reed will see you now." Victoria stood and followed her toward a private conference room. As the doors came into view, her heartbeat quickened. She took a slow breath and stepped forward. On the other side of that door waited a man who could have responded with bitterness, anger, or humiliation. Instead, she was about to discover what true strength actually looked like. Victoria stepped into the conference room and immediately saw Marcus Reed standing near the window. Sunlight reflected across the Hudson behind him, casting soft silver light through the glass. He turned as she entered and offered a polite nod. Nothing in his expression suggested triumph. Nothing suggested resentment. If anything, he seemed remarkably calm. That made the moment even harder. Victoria had prepared arguments during the entire drive across Manhattan. She had rehearsed explanations. She had reviewed financial projections and growth forecasts. Yet the instant she entered the room, those talking points felt strangely irrelevant. Marcus gestured toward a chair. "Please, have a seat." His voice carried the same quiet confidence she remembered from the boardroom. Victoria sat down. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The silence was not hostile. It simply felt honest. Finally, Victoria looked directly at him. "I owe you an apology." Marcus remained silent. She continued. "Not because we lost the investment. Not because of the consequences. Because I judged you before I knew anything about you." The words seemed heavier once they were spoken aloud. Marcus folded his hands on the table. "Why?" Victoria blinked. "Why what? Why did you assume I had nothing valuable to say?" The question was simple, yet it struck deeper than any accusation could have. Victoria searched for an answer. She wanted to blame pressure. She wanted to blame stress. But neither explanation felt true. "Because I looked at you and made assumptions," she admitted quietly. "And I was wrong." Marcus studied her face for a moment. Outside the window, a ferry moved slowly across the river. The room remained still. "Do you know what interested me most during my visit?" he asked. Victoria shook her head. "It was not your technology. It was not your financials. It was how people behaved when they thought someone insignificant was speaking." The words settled heavily between them. Marcus continued. "Most companies tell investors who they are. Very few show investors who they are." Victoria lowered her eyes. She remembered the laughter in the room. She remembered the uncomfortable glances. Most of all, she remembered how quickly everyone had accepted her judgment. "The report was not really about me, was it?" she asked. Marcus slowly shook his head. "No, it was about culture." Another silence followed. Then Marcus stood and walked toward a bookshelf on the far side of the room. He picked up a framed photograph and returned to the table. The picture showed a younger version of himself standing beside an older woman. Both were smiling. "My mother," he said. "She worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood." Victoria studied the photograph. "She looks proud." Marcus smiled softly. "She taught me something I never forgot. She used to say that character is revealed by how people treat those who cannot help them." Victoria felt her throat tighten. Suddenly, she understood the real evaluation. It had never been about a presentation. It had never been about investment capital. It had been a test no one realized they were taking. Marcus placed the photograph back on the table. "The question is not whether Sterling Dynamics deserves funding," he said quietly. "The question is whether Sterling Dynamics is willing to become the kind of company that deserves trust." For the first time since entering the room, Victoria did not think about money at all. She thought about leadership. She thought about responsibility. And she realized that the most valuable thing Marcus Reed had brought in her life was not $500 million. It was the truth. Victoria sat quietly for several moments after Marcus finished speaking. The conference room felt different now. The tension that had followed her into the building had slowly given way to something deeper. Reflection. Through the glass walls, afternoon sunlight painted soft patterns across the polished table. The city continued moving outside, but inside the room, time seemed to slow. "I cannot change what happened yesterday," Victoria finally said. "But I can change what happens next." Marcus listened without interrupting. She leaned forward slightly. "For years, I believed leadership meant always having the answer. Always moving faster. Always staying ahead. Somewhere along the way, I stopped listening." Her voice was calm, but honest. "When you spoke in that boardroom, I did not hear your question. I only saw someone I assumed did not belong there." Marcus nodded once. "Many people make that mistake." Victoria looked down at her hands. "That does not make it right." Another silence followed. Yet this one felt lighter. The kind of silence that appears when people stop defending themselves and begin telling the truth. Marcus folded his hands together. "Do you know why I agreed to meet with you?" Victoria looked up. "Because you wanted to explain the report?" A faint smile appeared on Marcus's face. "No." He glanced toward the river beyond the windows. "Because people are capable of growth." The word surprised her. After everything that had happened, she had expected caution, perhaps even skepticism. Instead, she found grace. Marcus stood and walked toward the window. Sunlight shimmered across the Hudson like liquid silver. "When I started Horizon, nobody wanted to invest," he said. "I sat through meetings where people barely looked at me. I watched opportunities disappear before conversations even started." Victoria remained silent. "I could have spent my life becoming bitter," Marcus continued. "But bitterness never builds anything." He turned back toward her. "The people who helped me succeed were not the ones who judged me. They were the ones who gave me a chance." The room grew still. Victoria felt the weight of those words settle inside her. For the first time, she understood why Marcus carried himself with such confidence. It was not because he had money. It was because he had perspective. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Marcus returned to the table and opened a folder resting beside him. Inside were several pages of notes. He slid them across the table. Victoria glanced down. They were not investment documents. They were recommendations. Leadership training initiatives. Employee listening programs. Mentorship structures. Community outreach plans. Practical steps designed to strengthen culture throughout Sterling Dynamics. Victoria looked up in surprise. "You prepared this?" Marcus nodded. "Yesterday, I rejected the company as it exists today." He paused. "That does not mean I rejected what it could become." Victoria stared at the pages. Her eyes moved slowly across each recommendation. None of them focused on profits. None focused on stock prices. Every suggestion focused on people. She felt something she had not experienced in a very long time. Humility. "Thank you," she said softly. Marcus smiled. "Do not thank me yet." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" Marcus looked toward the notes in front of her. "Because real change begins after the meeting ends." 1 year later, the atmosphere inside Sterling Dynamics felt completely different. The same headquarters still rose above Manhattan. The same glass walls reflected the skyline. The same boardroom overlooked the city. Yet the culture inside had changed in ways that could not be measured on a balance sheet. New mentorship programs connected executives with junior employees. Listening sessions became a regular part of leadership meetings. Managers were evaluated not only on performance, but also on how they treated the people around them. Employee retention reached record levels. Productivity increased. Innovation accelerated. Most importantly, people felt respected. On a bright autumn afternoon, Victoria Sterling stood near the boardroom window watching sunlight spill across the city. The room behind her was filling with executives, advisors, and team leaders preparing for a major announcement. This time, however, the mood felt different. There was confidence in the room, but not arrogance. Ambition, but not entitlement. A quiet knock sounded at the door. Victoria turned and smiled. Marcus Reed entered carrying the same worn leather portfolio he had carried a year earlier. Several people stood to greet him, not because of his wealth, not because of his influence, because they genuinely respected him. Marcus shook hands, exchanged greetings, and took a seat at the table. As he looked around the room, he noticed something important. People listened to one another. Junior employees spoke without fear. Questions were welcomed instead of dismissed. The change was unmistakable. Victoria stepped forward and placed a document on the table. The final partnership agreement. $500 million in growth capital. The opportunity that had once seemed lost forever. Marcus reviewed the pages carefully before signing his name. Victoria signed next. The agreement was complete. For a brief moment, the room remained silent. Then applause filled the space. Not loud, not dramatic, just sincere. Marcus closed the folder and looked toward Victoria. You built a stronger company than the one I evaluated a year ago. Victoria smiled. We had good guidance. Marcus shook his head gently. You had the courage to change. The words stayed with her, because she knew they were true. Real transformation had not happened because of an investment. It had happened because someone had forced her to confront a difficult truth and then offered grace instead of revenge. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over Manhattan, Marcus stepped out of the building and onto the sidewalk. The air was cool. Golden light reflected across the glass towers surrounding him. Behind him, employees continued celebrating inside. Ahead of him, the city stretched toward the horizon. He paused for a moment and looked up at the sky. Somewhere in the distance, the last rays of sunlight illuminated the windows of countless buildings, turning them into sheets of gold. Marcus smiled quietly and continued walking. Inside the boardroom above, Victoria watched through the glass as he disappeared into the crowd. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to, because the lesson had already been written long before the contract was signed. Status can open doors. Wealth can create opportunities. But character is what determines what happens once those doors are opened. And on that quiet autumn evening, as light faded across the city and the first stars appeared above the skyline, the silence itself felt like justice.